Now, as we know dependency injection, I think this is a good time to talk about $scope. The syntax we used here inside this ngController attribute value is called controller as syntax. Now we're going to use a new syntax called $scope syntax. So I'm going to remove this as app from my ngController directive, and I'll just refer to the controller name. When the controller gets created, AngularJS creates one more object called $scope and pass that object to the controller constructor function. I think you can sense some dependency injection here, right? Yes, look at here. This $scope object is not created inside this controller constructor function, and it's actually created and passed to this function by someone else. We can refer that someone else as Secret Santa for now, as we are going to discuss more about it in coming lectures. So suppose you have more than one controller. Secret Santa will create more than one $scope object. I mean one per controller. And I can use this $scope to define my model and even functions. So instead of using this, I can replace it with $scope object. Now, as this employee object is defined on $scope, I can directly refer it in my view. So I can remove all the references to app as I'm not using controller as syntax. Let's run and see the application. Nice. The view got rendered with correct data. But this time data is coming from $scope. Important point I would like to add is this $scope object is always gets created, whether you're using controller as syntax or $scope syntax. The controller as syntax is much cleaner than $scope syntax. But there are some special functions defined inside this $scope object. And if you want to use those functions, you can use the syntax. We are going to discuss about those functions in coming lectures. Now, before I conclude, I want to show you one example of how to define function on this $scope object. So I'm going to define a function, say show message on $scope object, and I'm going to do console.log of some text inside this function. Now to call this function, I'm going to add a button, and I'm going to add ngClick directive to call the function defined on the scope. Let's refresh the application. Open the console window, click on this button, and there we go. In summary, this $scope object acts as a glue between view and controller. So if we want to pass some data to view from controller, we will use $scope. And if we want to call some function from view on controller, we'll define it on $scope.